or the other independently of chromosomes.
I think we're starting to understand how the brain is hardwired differently between males and females.
Our gender, how we see ourselves, is determined by our brains as much as anything else. So it's quite likely, and one could imagine, that there'll be receptors in the brain which will respond to some of those hormones. So if the gene or those receptors in the brain are not functioning and not going to receive the male hormone, then that person may well have a feminine outlook. So the brain will influence gender as much as the gonads.
Science is starting to redefine the gender debate. For years, it was thought to be all about nurture, the way a child was raised. Feminist theory helped the idea along. Women limited themselves because they'd been stereotyped and socialised that way.
It's a reality of twisted and thwarted people, people who are twisted and thwarted because they're pushed into roles. Girls train themselves for their future. They take their dolls to the park. Mind you,
most of the theories of the time spoke about socialisation, spoke about the way parents train us into particular gender roles, and that was the prevailing model.
In the 60s and 70s, doctors believed the power of nurture was so strong it could be applied to children where their sex was ambiguous. The practice was to assign a baby, who often had both male and female genitalia, a gender. The child would then undergo genital surgery and be raised in its assigned sex. The theory was the child would grow up happy and well-adjusted. This philosophy was based on the work of a famous New Zealand psychiatrist, John Money.
Unfortunately, he was very powerful and influential at the time, and people took this theory as gospel.
And what do you think of that theory now?
I think if a total reliance on nurture as far as sort of determining sex is complete rubbish, I think it just doesn't happen.
Andi Hyder is an example of the failure of John Money's nurture theory. She was born with ambiguous or atypical genitalia. Doctors didn't know what sex she was, so they took a punt and decided she'd be a boy.
I guess we'd always been brought up in that generation to think that doctors were somewhat godlike. If you were told something, you believed it.
Andrew Hyder was a quiet, gentle little boy who always felt not quite right about his place in the world and didn't know why.
He was certainly not a typical boy, not out kicking footballs and roughhousing. He was great at fiddling around, making things, creating things, very good with his hands always.
Andy was never really terribly male or female, always slightly ambiguous. I guess looking back, I think Andy probably had a really difficult childhood.
Andi Hyder did a lot of the things that men do. She was into cars and mechanics. But despite the masculine pursuits, people often mistook Andi for female. As a man, she started to question her gender.
I sort of thought, well, if I'm not male, then I must be something else, and the only other thing is female. So for me, that was sort of the thing that made me realise, well, that's probably who I am.
Andi Hyder decided to do something about it. She applied for her medical records under the Freedom of Information Act. What she found shocked her. She was born with a rare but extreme intersex condition, partial androgen insensitivity syndrome. Andi Hyder has male chromosomes, but her body couldn't process enough masculine hormones, leaving her with many feminine attributes and ambiguous or atypical genitalia.
They obviously knew at the time what they were dealing with, but they just didn't tell my parents because it wasn't the culture to do so.
Your parents had no idea?
No.
I was outraged, I suppose, that in comparatively modern times, that anybody would make decisions about my child and, you know, her future without even telling me about it.
Well, it would have been after I got my medical records when I was about 30 years old and went and told my mother.
I know now that this was accepted practice, that you don't tell people about this. It's, you know, something that must be kept quiet and out of sight and out of mind. But
So Andy's case wasn't a one-off?
no.
Andy Hyder, a federal police officer, turned her anger into action. In her spare time, she became an advocate for people with intersex conditions. Andy says the culture has been not to tell parents, and particularly children, of their conditions. She wants that changed and is calling for full medical disclosure. Andy Hyder claims no amount of nurture will make someone a boy or a girl if they aren't one.
What I have an issue with now is the fact that the medical profession should have learned from stories like mine and learned from stories of other people and said, well, hang on, this isn't necessarily working. And there are options, there are other ways of treating this.
And the medical profession haven't learnt?
I don't think they have, to be perfectly honest.
I think Andy's life would have been a lot easier if she had known from the outset that you have a choice here. You know, you are this type of person, not male, not female. You find out for yourself. Rather than having something imposed on you that may not be the right thing.
Professor Gary Warne is an endocrinologist who's been working with intersex children for almost 30 years.
The medical profession thought they were in a privileged position of having the information and that the patients didn't need to be bothered by some of those painful facts.
He did actually start the sort of movement to tell the truth. And a lot of doctors said, no, you can't do that. You know, what gives you the right to turn around and ruin these people's lives? And as he said, well, it's not ruining their lives. And he was quite right.
Well,
In 2002, Gary Warne was made an honorary life member of the Androgen Insensitivity Support Group for his efforts to have intersex conditions disclosed. But he is a controversial figure. Like John Money before him, he still believes in surgically assigning a gender to babies with ambiguous or atypical genitalia. He believes failure to do this could damage the child.
I think that it exposes the child to the possibility of ridicule and embarrassment. It's something that would make them feel very different from other children.
Now, it's just ludicrous to turn around and say, well, let's try and alleviate some social embarrassment by surgically altering a child at that stage of their life.
Many doctors and advocates believe it's wrong to surgically change genitalia until a child can have its say. But Professor Warne says his policy, when in doubt, is to make a child a boy. It provides more choice.
It gives the person the greatest option when they grow up. They can easily reverse that and go back to female if they wish, but it's very hard to go the other way. So preserving options, I think, is what it's all about.
It's a very difficult clinical situation to be faced with. It's a very difficult assessment to make. And as I said, the current paradigm would be to wait and see as much as possible, whereas the old paradigm would have been to intervene, surgically reassign, and to raise the child unambiguously.
Some international studies challenge Professor Warne's view. In the US, 94 people with an intersex condition who had atypical genitalia were surveyed. More than half were unhappy with the sex they'd been assigned. Despite being raised as girls and having genital surgery, they became boys.
It's a hot point, but we've also recently completed our long-term follow-up study at this hospital, and we got it right 96% of the time. In our series, there were only 2 out of 50 who wanted to be the other sex.
So what is the AIS support group going on about when they say how badly they're being treated by doctors and how unhappy people are with surgery? Where are they coming from?
Well, I think that they're, unfortunately, a group of people who have had bad experiences and who feel empowered by belonging to a group and making their presence known.
Why doesn't their bad experiences then correlate with your study?